This hint will be about your graph for a monopoly. First thing to understand is that a monopoly involves a market where there is only one seller. It's a single seller. So in this case, the firm is actually equal to the market. Recall that our perfectly competitive firm had no influence over market price, and in fact, we can call such firms price takers. Well, this monopoly firm has complete control over price, so that we call a monopoly a price maker. Okay, so competitive firm, price taker, monopoly firm, price maker. All right, so the next thing that goes with that is the fact that the monopoly faces the entire market demand curve. So this is our supply and demand curve, P and Q. Notice the big Q because this is the entire market. That is the entire market demand curve here, the whole market demand curve. There are not going to be two graphs, one for the market and one for the firm. There's just going to be one. The next thing we're going to add to this graph is the monopolist's marginal cost curve, which we're going to put in a typical shaped marginal cost curve here. Next, we're going to add a marginal revenue curve. Now, remember that the competitive firm had a marginal revenue curve that was just equal to the demand curve. That is not going to be the case for the monopolist. For the monopolist, they are going to have a marginal revenue curve that looks something like this. Let's compare this with what had happened with our perfectly competitive firm. Our perfectly competitive firm, if you recall, had a demand curve that was flat at the equilibrium market price, right? And this is the, this is little q, this is the PC firm, the perfectly competitive firm, and their demand curve was the same as their marginal revenue curve. Why? Well, the definition of marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in Q, or the additional revenue gained from the sale of the last unit. Now, in the case of the perfectly competitive firm, that additional revenue from one more unit sold is always equal to the competitive price, because no matter how many units they sell, they are still going to get that same unit price, the equilibrium competitive price. This is not the case over here with the monopoly firm. For the monopoly firm, the more they sell as they go this way on the quantity axis, they have to deal with this downward sloping demand curve, which means that they have to offer a lower price in order to get these higher quantities. So this essentially causes this marginal revenue curve to be kicked down below the demand curve, okay? Because every time they sell another unit, they do get additional revenue for it, but they also have to take a price reduction, which applies to all the units that they produce, not just the last marginal unit. So that is the reason why the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve for the monopoly. Again, not the case over here in perfect competition. So let's return to our monopoly graph and ask, where is this firm going to set its output? Well, we know that it's still going to follow that basic profit maximization rule. And recall that that rule is to choose output so that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay? So keep producing output as long as marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, but don't go past the point where they're equal. On our graph, that's actually going to occur right here, right? This is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We come down and we notice we're going to label this QM for the monopoly quantity. Now, so we've chosen our output. We have an extra step here that we didn't have in competition, and that extra step is, how much will the monopolist charge in terms of a price for this output? Well, you would think that they would just charge this same amount. It would just come right over here. But they don't have to do that. they can charge as much as the market will bear. And in this case, the market will bear what the demand curve tells you. It goes straight up to the demand curve. And now we see this is the price, that is the maximum price that firm can get away with charging. So we're going to label this PM for the monopolist price. Okay, so we have the monopoly's decision to produce QM based on where MR equals MC. And then we have the price PM, which is determined by how much the market will bear for that quantity QN. It'll bear this price up here, okay? Now, we're going to notice that this price is higher than it would have been if this was competition. If this was competition, we could kind of call the marginal cost curve the supply curve, and here's our whole market demand curve. So we could mark on here a point where supply would have equaled demand if this was the world of competition, and we would have this be our QC, and over here we would have this be our PC. We can now compare monopoly and competition and see that the monopolist charges a higher price, PM is higher than PC, and they also produce a lower quantity. QM is lower than QC. And this means that the monopoly's results are what we call in economics inefficient. Okay? They are not the best results given the initial distribution of resources that we can have for this society. The price is too high, the quantity is too low.